Hey everyone, this is the SIG-Auth meeting for June 22nd. Let's see, tomorrow is enhancements freeze for V125. So we're just going to go over some of the open SIG-Auth caps to make sure we get those in. So Mike, you and I reviewed this. I think this one is relatively fine. I just have basically one open question, which is, I know David's not here, but it's basically, this is not, we are proposing this to not be part of conformance. And as such, we want to be able to turn it off. And I said that turning it off using the runtime config seems impractical because you would turn off the entire authentication group. It doesn't sound like a good idea on any cluster you care about.
You can disable using runtime config down to the resource level.
You can, because I was staring at the code and I was like, this does not look like it supports resource.
David added that as part of disabling beta APIs by default.
Okay, so that, okay, so it's, all right, so that just means this part needs to be updated to the whatever the syntax is for disabling a particular resource. Was that relatively recent?
Yes. It was added in 123 or 124, 124 probably. 124 is when we said that new beta APIs would not be on by default. And
Right.
Part of that was needing resource level control over enablement and disablement. So if they're not on by default, then you need to be able to turn on a particular API. I see the comments. What version was that on? Because I'm pretty sure that capability was only added in 124.
Oh yeah, so that's why, Max, you're on an older cluster, so it didn't support that syntax. And I didn't read too deeply into the implementation of runtime config, but my initial—
Yeah, you shouldn't, because your eyes will bleed.
Yeah, it didn't look fun, and I was like, I don't really understand what this monster does. But okay, so all right, so Max, I think we just need to figure out the syntax for exactly disabling this particular resource. I assume it's group and resource, right? Not like version, like it doesn't include also version.
No, it's group / version / resource.
All right, well, wonderful. So we'll just have to figure out the incantation. And I think you could probably drop the whole bit about a validating webhook. I don't think we would recommend you do that if there is a specific syntax for this. So I think that was my only open thing on this one. Otherwise, I think David did not back it from PRR, but I don't think he had anything else either, because he basically said, hey, Mike and Mo, go read this and tell me if it's good. Mike, did you have anything else on this?
No, it looked fine.
Okay, cool. So I'm gonna say, Max, if you fix that one bit up, will be good and implementable in 125. So that's good. Is Tahir here? I don't see him with the phone.
I think he's out this week, but I would say let's go over it as well.
Yeah. So I did watch the recording from last time, and I thought about the whole like revocation thing, and I think I generally agree with what y'all were saying last time. I think the only question I had about the revocation stuff is if we build some, or we presumably will have to add some code into client Go for using this resource and having trust based off of it. Would we want to build within that the capability of looking at those extensions for like the OCSP URLs and stuff? So that way, if you were using our code, you got sort of that for free. Like I don't think the client side aspect of this is discussed much in the CAP. It's more of just about the server side. This was just kind of a question I had. How would you want to do that?
What do you mean by built-in?
So like, I think what we're saying is that if you want revocation, that's cool. Use one of the existing extensions within X509 that lets you do that. All I was saying there is that seems okay, but will we provide any like code that does that for you already in client Go? Basically, like if you want to, if you're a Go project and you want to consume one of these things, would we help you do that?
I would probably lean towards no unless we start using it. Maybe in the printer, keep control printer or something to add introspection support.
Yeah. Let's see, other things I had. So I think I generally like the design that's here now with just having a dedicated field for spec.signer name and just using admission to enforce it. It is a little bit strange to me that it's optional, but I get why. I think the use case is fine, which is just to have CA bundles that are not attached to a specific signer in the sense of a Kubernetes signer.
Mm-hmm.
So I think, Mike, you had said that you did not want a direct binding. I guess I'd ask why. What's the concern?
What do you mean?
A direct binding for RBAC, for system authenticated. So I think you had said that you want create pod to sort of indirectly give you access to this. One of the side effects of having the name of both the object and the sets within it be just strings that somebody came up with is that they're kind of hard to discover. So I was just trying to think of ways to make it so that one could do that. And if the information is meant to be public on the cluster itself, and if we added like field selector support for the signer name, like it would be really nice to be able to just be like, hey, kubectl get cluster trust bundle field selector the signer name I want, and you'll be like, all right, cool. Here's the stuff on this cluster, and I can configuring my pods. I know what to do.
Right. I guess what does that have to do with the RBAC binding, or?
It's without an RBAC binding there, that's not universally going to work, right? Like somebody would have to set up the cluster in that way to give you access.
I mean, having a default RBAC binding that allows anyone authenticated to view seems like the right option. How exactly it's expressed is, not really an issue.
Right.
Yeah.
Basically, I get the sense I got from the KEP was that we're okay with an indirect implication on being able to read all the data in this API. And I'm like, can we just make it direct? So that way the names are less magical, like the names of the object sets within them.
So like imagine a situation where you have you're running like a builder or something where you have maybe bunch of tenants that are running like builds in containers for I don't know, building a website or running like, I guess, Hugo or something. In that situation, you at runtime, you don't want the tenants to have access to the read arbitrary data about the cluster. What you really want is the runtime to be isolated. So I guess there's a distinction between like authorship of the pod spec and like the running pod, which I think is important.
Would
Do you
it
buy that?
do by running the pod without a service account then? Like if you don't want them to be able to poke into the cluster?
Yeah, I guess you would not auto mount the token would be a better approach there. But I do think that there's a distinction between like authorship and runtime that is important. I would not like all authenticated to have access to cluster trust bundles inherently.
Well,
Okay.
it's not inherent, it's just the explicit default. Like there's nothing that says that cluster administrators can't remove that role binding if it's in the defaults.
We shouldn't
Require a
put
lot more work.
default. We shouldn't make default role bindings if there's a plausible reason people would need to remove those. We should only be creating default role bindings that we're basically sure could be universal.
And that is the general stance we've taken with the default so far, is to make it so that needing to patch stuff out of it is possible because that's supported within the reconcile loop, but it's supposed to be exceptional because it's kind of annoying and puts you in this weird state because your RBAC no longer gets reconciled, which is kind of against the point of RBAC reconciliation in the first place. Would a approach like we took for the OIDC discovery stuff be more amicable, where we bind it to system service accounts? That way I could at least impersonate a service account and then read it myself instead of having to make a pod.
That would be better, although I would defer that until there's like a real need for it. Because like we intend for service account, or I guess things running on the cluster, to consume this via volumes. I guess it would be.
Yeah, but how do I know what to put in my volume spec? Because now all the things are magic. Like there's 2 magic strings inside my volume spec now, the name of the cluster trust bundle and the set within it, which I have to somehow just be told now.
The cluster administrator is responsible for distributing that to their users.
Yeah, isn't that always going to be? You're always going to have to.
Yeah, but the original design was I had to know 1 string, which was the name of the signer. Now I have to know 2 strings that are actually unrelated to the signer.
Yeah.
Like I think the API is expressed better and is less magical in the sense of the name isn't like weirdly deterministic based on some algorithm on the designer name, but I'm trying to think of like myself installing something into a cluster using tooling and would like to make it somewhat more automatic instead of having to know magic strings.
Yeah, are you suggesting that there should be like a default like association of trust anchor sets with signers or something like that? So I still just as a user need to specify the signer I want, and then maybe I can override the default if I really want, but otherwise I just get like what the signer gives me or what that association is.
Most clusters want a default system authenticated can view these. Because it's not as if they're not enumerable by just creating a bunch of pods with, likely signer name, creating pods with likely signer name mounts and trying to figure out if those exist.
Yeah, I was more just thinking in the sense of this sounds like public information for things that aren't on the cluster. So how do you express that? And to me, that's systemful.
I personally think that trying to disguise it, even in the case of a shared cluster, trying to disguise that signers exist is the wrong approach. These are fundamentally public opinions, but I do understand why people want to avoid that.
Yeah.
I think there's a distinction too between whether the information is considered private and whether we want to encourage like consuming that information via list watch like requests. Like if we I think the continuum is probably start with the volume consumption via volumes, because that's the clearest use case. Then if there was evidence that people were fetching it via the API, they can grant the permission to get the well-known names via the API themselves. It's not like they're blocked from creating a deployment where a service account fetches it from the API. They can do that if there's evidence that that's a generally useful thing. I think the next step would be to grant get access on the particular well-known names that we have corresponding to the signers, because it's a lot easier for us to reason about, like, here are the Kubernetes signers. We can make judgments about whether those trust anchor sets are reasonable to consume. It's harder for us to make judgments about, like, how is every trust anchor set going to be consumed.
I would just put it in the docs. Here is how you add the permission. Like, do we already have docs around permissions that your cluster probably should have, but are not included because somebody might not want to have them? We have docs on nearly every pod that runs anywhere sane has the pod anti-affinity, right? That's just in the docs. Maybe we just add this to the using cluster role bindings docs to create this, or cluster trust bindings docs, create this role binding so that people can actually list which signers exist.
I mean, we should document the ways to consume it. If we expect volume consumption to be the normal one, then we should document that, and then say, if you want to pull from the API, here's how you can grant that permission. That seems perfectly reasonable.
Yeah, I think that's how we phrase it in the docs, is you should tell your users here, but if you want to give them the ability to list which signers have trust bundles available, here's how you do so.
Okay. Okay, I think that's fine. I'm not going to necessarily push on this one too hard. I lean towards making the thing more useful from a default standpoint. One of the things that Tier has in here is RBAC associated with being RBAC that is enforced via admission, that is for a similar signer name restriction. And I was trying to come up with a verb to describe what it means to control a signer name on one of these objects. So far, I came up with the word entrust, which I don't necessarily think is exactly the right word. It's kind of vaguely close to what I want. As an example, the word sign and approve are the other two existing verbs we have. Does anybody have some good suggestions for being able to set a signer name? I'm not sure if there's a word that describes this concept.
And I had missed the details of this bit. This is basically checking something similar to CSRs. So before you sign or approve a CSR for a signer name, you have to have specific permission for that signer name. This is something similar for the trust anchor sets.
Yeah, so you need general update on a cluster, whatever bundle in RBAC to be able to issue the update at all. But then if that object has a signer name defined, which is immutable once set, you must have this extra permission to be allowed to update that specific signer. In the kept here was like, I think writing it out like as a full like CRUD style echo, and I was like, I'm not sure why you would do that. I just said you would just use a custom word like we did for the other thing, mostly because all the code for it already exists. And so I was trying to come up with a verb that described the act of creating / updating a bundle.
Update bundle.
That's not really a verb, but sure, that could be okay. That could be okay.
I'm okay with describing the mechanism and then deferring the particular name to the implementation. Say like, here are the ideas, something along these lines.
Yeah, that's fair. Okay, I think we can leave it. That's fine. As long as we get the mechanism that actually maxes the other one, I think I'd be happy. As long. Let's see. This one is basically they have a field, like a one of API in the volume thing. I'm pretty sure SIG API machinery is all in on discriminators, and you need to have a discriminator even if you don't have a thing right now that needs a discriminator. I think that covers most of the stuff there. I think two high-level stuff I had is I don't think we have a PRR on this. I think we need one because this is like I have concerns around like performance of this thing. Like I don't fully understand exactly how much work the kubelet is going to be doing to keep all these up to date, especially if you have a large amount of pods using it. But I think
does this go into discussions about updates to the content while a pod is running?
Yeah, it says that the kubelet will keep it up to date. And one of the questions I asked is, well, like, how often does it do that? Yeah. And just in general, I don't. There's like no metrics and stuff discussed, so I don't know how like an admin would understand how much CPU this is basically consuming across their cluster or anything like that. So I do think we want to have at least some amount of resolution there, and since David is out, I don't know who I think John and Wojtek are the other two PRR folks. So
what metrics do we already have on config maps? Because we should mirror as much as possible metrics on config maps.
I'm not sure if config maps is a good target because config maps are really old, so they predate our PRR process, meaning they don't necessarily reflect what we would do today.
But in terms of like visibility to performance, I mean, config maps and secrets did cause performance issues, and the scalability team did a fair amount of work to try to improve that, and even added things like immutable config maps and secrets, so you can flag things that shouldn't change, so that people who hit specific problems could dig themselves out of holes by marking objects as unchangeable to stop the kubelet from doing work on those.
Yeah, that to me sounds like a really bad bandage. I mean, it works. I understand what it's doing.
If you're going to run 100,000 pods, maybe don't mount tokens in and mark your secrets as immutable. Like, there are things you got to cut off to get the scale targets you want. So at least having the options are better than not.
Yeah. But so what should we do in regards to PR for this? Because I don't think we can merge this without that, right?
Yeah, I think there's a lot that still needs. So I have not commented on the Kev about this yet, but I think the API needs a fair amount of work. I'm kind of confused by the complexity, specifically like multiple non-default trust anchor sets in a cluster bundle. I don't understand why there's one. Does anybody here know, or should we wait for it to hear for something like that?
I don't think I've understood the question. Like,
the cluster trust bundle has a status, and it is a trust anchor sets, which contains multiple like essentially bundles of certificates.
Right.
The intent is that eventually, and this is very much a Google Alts use case first and foremost. The intent is that eventually you will be able to say, for this bundle, for this particular, group, you use this CA bundle. For this other group, you use a different CA bundle, where there are multiple CA bundles there are multiple CA bundles contained within one cluster trust bundle, separated out. I don't think that that's the right approach to this API, but that is how it was explained to me.
Why would you not use different signers? Sorry, I think I cut you off.
Because Alts wants to make use of subsigners in a way that is very sensible, but doesn't actually work in X509. Right?
I think we can't. So that is a very opinionated response to this. I don't think we can do this question justice without both sides, right?
I absolutely agreed.
So I'll defer that question. I think the other one is actually I have two more comments on the API. The other one is this has a status with conditions. Similar APIs for projected volumes, data distribution do not have conditions. I'm not sure about the value of that. It says the documentation says ready when the signer, for the signer to indicate to the kubelet that the cluster trust bundle object is up to date. I don't get that, because when it goes stale, why doesn't the signer just update it? Not sure if there's value in a status field here. And then I think the final confusing point about this API is the actual trust anchor's projection has files, trust anchor set file, and flat file types. I'm wondering if we can simplify this a bit for actually how we reference these trust anchor sets from pod specs, because this seems flexible, but not very intuitive and much more complex than what we have for other projected volume types.
Yeah, so certainly I think you could get rid of this slice, right? You could just say that there can only be one, because you can have more than one projection, right? You can just add more if you needed more than one. And then this bit over here is the thing that's missing the discriminator, because the idea is the reason for this being included is right now it's just a flat file. Maybe someday we'd add support for like a Java key store, which I do not recommend, because but whatever. I'm sure somebody can write the code to make a Java key store in Go. But yeah, it is a little bit flexible. While we're picking on the API, one of the questions I had that I forgot to write is, if I decide to pick a Kubernetes signer name, is that okay? Can I say that, I forget the name of our signers, but one of our signers has this bundle? Is that all right? Seems not okay.
Oh, what do you mean?
Like I can't remember the name, but maybe Jordan, you remember the cluster auth signers. Like we have 4 of them, right? That the CSR controller does. They have specific signer names in our API. So if I was to go make a bundle and just say, hey, by the way, this Kubernetes signer, this is the CA bundle associated with it, is that okay? I don't think it's okay, because that doesn't really make sense. So I would either expect the API to just flat out reject that, or there would be some mechanism for those to be reserved for somehow.
I mean, whatever mechanism. So using this to distribute trust anchors for Kubernetes signers seems plausible to me.
Right.
When you say, like, if I were to create an object, who are you? If you're a cluster admin, then maybe this is how you're populating the trust anchor sets for the Kubernetes signers. Like, if there's an authorization check around, permission to populate for a particular signer name, then I haven't thought a lot about it, but you populating trust anchors for Kubernetes signers in these objects doesn't offend me.
What I'm hearing though is probably what we would ask. So this KEP right now does not say anything about the controller manager, but maybe it should. Maybe it should have some mechanism that tells the controller manager, hey, you're passed in the CA bundle for all these things, I think, or at least some of them. You should go populate objects in the API that match it, because that's where we expect people to actually consume it now. Like, you have an API.
It seems plausible that our signer would reconcile the CA bundles. We need to be careful that, so the signer is given a singular certificate to sign with. That doesn't mean that is the full bundle, especially in rotation cases or HA cases. So I think it's worth mentioning and discussing, like, how does this interact with the Kubernetes signers? Are we going to create objects that hold the bundles for the Kubernetes signers? Which component's going to do that? How's it going to do that? How do we handle rotation cases? Like right now, the API server is the one who is given the full bundle of acceptable client CAs. So but that's not universal. Like, the API server isn't the one that's verifying all of the certificates for all of the Kubernetes signers. It knows about the client CAs, but that's about it, maybe. I'm not sure. Anyway, I think that should be mentioned and clarified and discussed, and say, like, are we going to create objects? Are we not? If we are, where and how, and what's the expectation there?
Good. So I think what I'm hearing though is, I think Ted, you had some comments. I would ask you to write those as a comment in the KEP. I think Mike, you did too, and I'll take the one about describing that. Well, the built-in signers probably should do something with their own bundles in this somehow. But I think what I'm hearing is that this is not ready for 125, and I think that's okay. Just but do folks agree with that? I'm going to move it out of the milestone to indicate that.
Yeah.
Okay. I'll do that now, and then I will, after the fact, update the stuff. So I think, I don't remember. I don't think this is in the KEP tracking sheet anyway, so I think that part is okay. Okay, is there anything else folks want to discuss on this? We have 20 minutes and we still have at least one more KEP, I think. Okay, so the next one is Mike or Jordan. Have either one of you read this one? Any chance? Or Rita? Have any of you all read this?
I opened the link that you sent me to the comment that you made, and other than that, I had not seen it.
Okay, well, that is like my biggest confusion on this, which is, so all right, so the high level of this proposal is to allow for a fully structured configuration CLI, pass it via CLI flag to the API server that when the feature flag is enabled, is mutually exclusive with the existing authorization CLI flag. In particular, it lets you specify as many webhooks, authorization webhooks as you want. And then it also lets you specify in which order they go into with the like the node authorizer and the RBAC authorizer and that type of stuff. One specific thing that David has asked for is I want to be able to deny system colon masters. So I want that to be represented in this chain. So I may order it appropriately, as in I might want to put a deny authorizer in front of it. And while I believe that is technically possible, I don't think it actually works because I think this group name system colon masters has sort of leaked out of our code base and is embedded in many external consumers as a thing that is always allowed to do all the things. So I'm not sure if we can realistically enforce any constraints on this group anymore.
Or not just out of our code base, but even things built from our code base running in a distributed way, like aggregated API servers.
Right. So yeah, that I pointed out that like the delegated authorization options just hard code this as a thing that is like always allowed because it's supposed to be within our code base. RBAC just says if you have this group, you're allowed to do anything on RBAC.
Yep.
So I mean, like this one is fixable, I guess, but this one is not, I think. But like, I feel like somewhere in here, David said that they carried Apache and OpenShift to make this work. So now I'm like real confused on like, make what work? I don't think it works at all, David.
Yeah, I mean, being able to define multiple webhooks and order them relative to other configurable authorizers seems reasonable and plausible and useful.
Right.
It seems like what David's asking for, which is I want to take the always on first in the chain super user authorizer and move where it happens in the chain. That seems like a distinct feature request thing with its own considerations. And if we allowed that to be movable, then it could be ordered along with other authorizers in this. So I think this is independent of what David described about subjecting the super user group to webhook authorization.
Okay.
That's my 10-second take on it.
Yeah. No. Yeah. I can see it. I'm just not sure. I think I'm just stuck on the. I just don't think what David is asking for is technically feasible within an ecosystem. I think it's enforceable just within our code base at a point in time, but not anything further. And I don't think we would be satisfied with that enforcement.
Maybe. I mean, authorization runs before anything else gets a crack at the request, and anything else that is doing authorization checks would be using like subject access review would enforce it, and things that are using their own authorization logic maybe are already off in the weeds. Like we have a hard time making any sort of guarantee about things that have built their own isolated authorization checks, right?
Yeah, but like for example, I have servers that I have written myself that are based off of k/API server that delegate back to the API server, but they are hard coded with a check right now that says if presented with an identity in this group, don't bother delegating because that's just a waste of a network call.
Yeah, I think those would be the questions we would ask in a separate KEP that was trying to order the super user authorizer. But I don't think that is blocking for this.
Okay.
That's my.
All right, I'm less sure what to do with this KEP now because David has asked for this pretty explicitly. So I'm now like, yeah, okay. That's a further conversation to have.
If we scope this to define multiple webhooks and allow ordering the multiple webhook authorizers, that doesn't cut us off from in the future letting you order the privileged authorizer in that set explicitly instead of it implicitly going at the beginning like it does today.
Yeah. Okay. Was someone just trying to say something? Yeah.
And I'm happy to jump in and comment on that aspect.
Yeah. I'm trying to remember what other things I had. One thing I had asked for, which I believe is not possible, is so right now there's no way to pre-filter any webhook from being invoked. So the reason I would want this is I would like to be able to self-host an authorizer that is at the very top of the chain that is allowed to do denies. And I can't think of any way to do that that doesn't break everything. That, I mean, unless it can't filter out like system phone master or something.
What kind of filtering do you mean?
The ability, so like to take a very specific specific example, if Jordan, if you remember how the OpenShift scopes authorizer is implemented, it only acts on requests that have a particular extra field because it knows that the OpenShift auth stack was the one that actually did the authentication and not like the Kubernetes code. So that's kind of the filter I would like to be able to express is if a resource or a user looks like this, then and only then invoke this webhook, otherwise skip it entirely. So that way I could have at the very top of my chain a self-hosted deny authorizer. But no, it's not going to like completely destroy the cluster if that component is offline. Because right now it's real easy to make a circle, as described here. Actually, I think what's described here basically says you cannot self-host the authorizer because it's just not safe. It's kind of meh.
Yeah, that seems useful. I don't know how strongly we should hold that as a requirement for like being able to define multiple webhooks and being able to make them like a structured config for it seems useful. The filtering aspect is a lot easier to do. It's like possible to do once you have an actual config. So I just don't have a sense for how much time or complexity that would add. I wouldn't want to delay the ability to have multiple of them and having like a real config format. I wouldn't want to delay it just to do filtering.
Right. So if we want this to land in 125, if we scoped at least the alpha of it down to just basically structured config for
ordering.
Yeah, structured config with its explicit ordering. Oh, that does leave one question. So one thing that's a little bit unclear in this doc is the exact. Let me find this so I can point out what I'm saying. So like weirdly, it still has a kube config path in there, but also this and this. So it's just I think this is a typo. I think they meant to delete this and forgot to delete it based on some of the comments I've seen. But the gist of what I had asked is to not continue to use the kubeconfig format as a way of specifying what the webhook is, and instead like specify the URL you want. The harder part about that is then how do you specify auth? Because we have exec auth, we have OIDC auth, we have token auth. So
Yeah, I'm not eager to basically duplicate all those server config fields from kubeconfig.
Yeah. Yeah. I'm also not happy by using that file structure. It doesn't exactly make sense because it's not like what it's supposed to be for. So yeah, like that part's less clear to me. Like I honestly would rather just start with like, you get exec auth. So if you want auth, fine, you can host a plugin. So like no auth or exec, then at least you get cert and tokens if you want, because your exec auth plugin could literally be echo a token if you wanted. So like technically it does. It basically does all the things.
Making someone shell out to a command to get a token is abusive.
I know. I know it is, but at the same time, I don't necessarily want to. Yeah, like what should we do here? Should we basically have within the authentication substruct in this API a discriminator that says what type of auth they're trying to do, and then let you fill it out?
I don't know. We reference kubeconfig files from other structured config, like admission configuration. I don't know. I don't have a good answer right off the bat. Maybe I'm not as offended by referencing a kubeconfig as you are. I'm also thinking of people who are using webhook today, and like how do they get from where they are today to this? It's way easier if it's basically translating their flags into a stanza and then copy pasting that stanza and tweaking the one thing they want like ordering it differently. So is it what we would make if we were starting from scratch 7 years ago? Maybe not. But is it bad to like have it be coherent with the flag version? I don't know.
Would it be
I'll leave my comment about the super user authorizer order request being independent.
Would it be the end of the world if we had basically the same config structures that are in the kubeconfig today in this API, just the auth parts?
That makes this be a sensitive file if it contains a token, which I don't want.
Yeah.
I like the fact that the credential aspects are not inlined here.
That's true. Yeah.
That's the only specific thought I had about that.
Yeah, I don't know if I don't have a good answer on this. This one's really ugly. But yeah, the aspect of having secrets in a config file, I do agree with that. I don't want that because we just don't. I just don't want secrets in there. And that is where the credential plugins help. Then the secret isn't in the config file. But that's not true of tokens and SIG-Auth. I can't hear you anymore, Jordan. Is it just me?
Another possibility, I did mute myself. Another possibility is to inline the server stanza and the user stanza in this type and forbid the credential containing fields. So instead of token, you would have to say token file and like point to a file. And then like under the covers, we can take that and take the server stanza and the user stanza and dump them into an in-memory, basically make an in-memory kube config, and then we can use all the same client config construction. Like we just translate that internally. So that saves us from like a config file referencing a config file for sort of simple cases where they don't need to specify credentials and they don't need to specify a bunch of stuff. I don't know. Like I said, I'm not that offended by basically just translating the flags we have into a snippet. I think that's easy to understand for people who are currently using it. And it matches what we do for other admission config files. I don't know. I do have to drop though. So, sorry.
Do we feel like this is ready, or should we just wait till 126? Because we are kind of out of time.
I think
I'm
it
not
is
ready until today. I don't feel qualified to judge. But I mean, you've looked at it more. David's looked at it more. David had a short list of things, and one of those things I don't think should be addressed as part of this. I don't know. Maybe it's ready.
Mike, what were you saying? I don't think I heard.
I think this was kind of a late comer. I've not looked at it 13 days ago, so this wasn't even out last SIG-Auth. I think this would be a rush to get in. It freezes this Thursday.
It's tomorrow.
Right, tomorrow. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I'm okay if we just decide that the runway is too short, because like Max is kept. We talked about like 3 different times, and then it was basically just write the kept. This one we talked about a very long time ago, I think, but there was like a many month gap between a conversation and an actual kept.
Right. If you think it's really close, I can give it a review tonight.
The kube config stuff makes me a little unsure, but if you want to look at it, I guess what I'd ask is, if you have time between now and freeze, look at it. If you feel that strongly enough to say that you think it's ready, then we can pursue it. Otherwise, I'm okay if it slips and we just take more time on it. Because SIG-Auth has like, I don't know, 7 keps being tracked right now for 125, so I think we are pretty well committed. Does that sound fair?
That sounds good.
Okay, cool. Well, we have like 20 seconds left in the meeting, so I'm going to say that's the meeting. All right, y'all. We'll see you in 2 weeks.